Okay. As we've seen, Shakespeare started life with writing comedies and made his reputation with the history plays, or made his money too with the history plays. He took a couple stabs at tragedy in the 1590s. We looked at Titus Andronicus, a very interesting but also in many ways deeply flawed play. And of course, in the middle of that is Romeo and Juliet. But he doesn't really turn to tragedies as a genre till late in the 1590s and really into the 1600s. Lots of people talk about the fact that there's an artistic progression. You know, as a young man, he makes his reputation with the history plays. He starts to make some money. The world looks good. He's artistically or temperamentally suited to writing comedies where there's real world resolutions to things, and things end well in some respects. But then, as happens in many people's lives, after that initial sort of sense of success and well-being, he gets skeptical. He gets cynical about the world, and you maybe see this in some of the what are called problem plays, Measure for Measure or All's Well That Ends Well. These are comedies that have some really darker sides to them, and that onset of what we might in the contemporary world call middle age leads him to start writing tragedies. That kind of psychologizing is always risky as a critic, but I put it out there for you to consider. But as we're moving towards that time period in Shakespeare's artistic development, the early 1600s, where he's going to produce the great tragedies that have secured his place as one of the greatest artists in the history of the world. Othello, Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth. These are the big plays that everyone knows, that perform the most, that have the richest and deepest critical tradition. They've spawned the most thought. They've generated the most dissertations. They are extraordinary accomplishments. Of these plays, Othello is perhaps unusual in that it's called a bedroom tragedy. That is, its title character, the Decasibus figure who starts off life well, right? He starts with a marriage, and that marriage is going to devolve, right, or fall apart. Is not a king or a prince. He's a general, and the tragedy affects his immediate household. It doesn't affect the rest of the world around them in the way that Hamlet, as a prince, his tragedy affects all of Denmark, or King Lear, his tragedy affects his whole world, or Macbeth, his tragedy affects all of Scotland. And so people have called Othello a domestic or bedroom tragedy because the title character gets hurt and his immediate household is hurt, but because of his social position, which is fairly high up, but not as high, doesn't affect everyone. So the play is unusual in that respect in the tradition of the great tragedies. It's also unusual in that lots of people want to consider the play not necessarily the title character's play, but Iago. You have the two great characters in this play: Othello, the great North African Moor general, who says at the beginning of the play, when his integrity is questioned, "I must be found. This is who I am," as opposed to Iago, the deeply cynical, pathologically cynical lieutenant who says, "I am not what I am." They're mirroring or mimicking or twisting the words of Yahweh. Two great characters in this play: Iago, who is, depending on how you look at things or decide to look at things, is either a brilliant Machiavellian deceiver or just a really ugly personality who tricks a very strong man. But critics have sort of gone back and forth over this. Whose play is this, Othello's or Iago's? Nonetheless, through these two characters, I want to start by talking to say that Shakespeare stages two very different versions of the self, what we've been talking about. Again, Othello, mature, 50-ish, successful, says what he thinks and says what he means, has this core sense of self. There's no duplicity in Othello whatsoever. You know, some would say he would be better off if there was a little bit more duplicity in him. That's one type of version of self, as opposed to Iago, who's constantly performing, constantly making himself up, constantly deceiving. You never really sort of know what's inside Iago. A great critic, poet of the 19th century, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, called him a motiveless malignity, we never quite know why Iago does what he does. But more interestingly than Iago's motives is the simple fact of that he seems to be this sort of very empty self. Even when he's speaking soliloquies on stage, you're not sure whether you can believe him or not. Iago engages then what's often referred to as the paradox of the pathological liar. And the paradox of the pathological liar is this: I am a pathological liar. Do you believe me?